Few characters in The Lord of the Rings are as misunderstood as Boromir. For many, he is just the one who tried to steal the ring, an impulsive warrior consumed by temptation. But that view could not be more wrong. Boromir was neither a villain nor a mere obstacle in Frodo's path. He was a hero, a tragic hero, forged under the weight of responsibility and shaped by the duty to protect Gondor at any cost. Tolkien did not write Boromir to be perfect. On the contrary, he represents the most human side of great warriors: doubt, error, and sacrifice. While Aragorn was the promised king, Boromir was his people's shield, a man who lived and died for his homeland, fighting until his last breath to defend those he loved. And ironically, it was precisely his humanity, his flaws, his weaknesses, his desperate attempt to find a solution, that led to his downfall. But would it be fair to call him weak? Boromir held his ground where many would have fallen. He fought against the forces of Mordor, against the whispers of the One Ring, and in the end found redemption not through words, but through deeds. His death was not just a tragic end. It was an act of pure heroism, a sacrifice that would echo throughout the history of Middle-earth. If you think you know Boromir, get ready to discover a side that few see. His journey is one of the most fascinating in The Lord of the Rings, and today we're diving deep into that story. Who was Boromir of Gondor? What led him to his tragic fate? And above all, what can we learn from him? Not every hero is born amidst glory. Boromir came into the world in the year 2978 of the Third Age, the firstborn of Denethor II, the steward of Gondor. From a young age, his destiny was already set, to bear the burden of a kingdom teetering before Mordor's threat. But before he could lift the sword, he had to deal with another battle, one that no one sees, yet leaves a deep mark: the loss of his mother. Finduilas passed away early when Boromir was only 10 years old, and what was left? A father growing, increasingly cold and distant, consumed by ominous portents and a secret affection for his younger son, Faramir. The absence of a mother shaped Boromir in a way that few realize. Without Finduilas' affection, he sought acceptance in the only place possible, on the training fields, among swords and shields. For Denethor, emotions were a luxury he could dispense with, but not courage and strength. So, Boromir learned to hide what he felt, to don his armor even before stepping into battle. Many saw him as an unshakable warrior, yet inside he harbored something deeper, the need to prove his worth, to show his father that he was worthy of leading Gondor. Thus, Boromir's figure gradually took shape, like the wall of Minas Tirith, imposing, steadfast, yet marked by the fissures of time. His relationship with Faramir was different. While his brother sought knowledge, Boromir sought action. The result: the firstborn became the symbol of Gondor's strength, the ideal heir in the eyes of the people. But that very expectation weighed upon his shoulders like an invisible burden. After all, what happens when someone is raised to be a shield, yet never learns to protect himself? The truth is, Boromir never had a choice. While other children listened to tales of Gondor's great battles, he was already being prepared to fight them. From early on, he trained with soldiers, rode for long distances, and studied war strategies. He didn't just become a warrior. He became a living legend within the walls of the White City. But a legend also carries scars, some of which are not visible on the skin, but reside in the soul. And so destiny began to chart paths that even Boromir could not foresee. His heart beat for the kingdom. His loyalty was unquestionable. But what of his future? Gondor needed a protector, someone capable of resisting the darkness rising in Mordor. And thus, unknowingly, Boromir was heading toward a calling that would come not from the battlefields, but from the very whispers of fate. From a very young age, Boromir understood that Gondor's survival depended on sharp swords and steadfast hearts. While other kingdoms enjoyed times of peace, Gondor lived in constant vigilance against the shadows creeping from Mordor. And Boromir didn't just accept that fate, he embraced it with fervor. He became a warrior like no other, a commander who led not through the nobility of his blood, but through the strength of his arm and the respect earned on the battlefield. If there's one thing Tolkien teaches us, it is that crowns do not make kings. It is the choices made amidst the storm that do. Before the walls of Osgiliath, Boromir showed the world why he was the most feared of Gondor's warriors. Sauron's assaults came like relentless tides, yet he held firm, like a rock against the storm. Amid broken spears and poisoned arrows, he fought alongside his men, never lagging behind them. In times when war shaped destinies, Boromir was not just a commander. He was a symbol of resistance. And when the city fell, it wasn't due to a lack of effort, but because even the bravest must retreat when the enemy's tide becomes overwhelming. But what makes a true protector is not only physical strength, but an unwavering commitment. Boromir could be a relentless warrior, yet his heart always belonged to the people. Unlike Denethor, who governed from the cold distance of the throne, Boromir walked among the soldiers, knowing their names and listening to their stories. He understood that Gondor's true strength was not only in the walls of Minas Tirith, but in the men and women who believed the kingdom could still stand. And it was that devotion that drove him to seek ways to win a war that seemed impossible. How do you face an enemy that never sleeps? How do you stop the darkness from devouring the last bastion of men? If there was a way to save Gondor, Boromir would do anything to find it, even if it meant challenging the very limits of his faith and judgment. For a protector carries not only a sword, but also the weight of the choices that must be made. And then came the dreams. Strange, persistent, almost like whispers of something greater than himself. In his visions, he saw a distant place, a name echoing in the shadows, Imladris. Was it a message, a warning, or a path he did not yet understand? Little did Boromir know that this quest would lead him to something far greater than he ever imagined. It wasn't just an ordinary dream, it was a calling. Boromir and Faramir shared enigmatic visions, whispered words that seemed to carry the very weight of Gondor's destiny. "Seek the broken sword in Imladris," the voice said, echoing from an age long past. But what did that mean? And why did this omen relentlessly torment Denethor's sons? Faramir, with his soul inclined toward wisdom and study, believed this dream was a divine sign. Boromir, practical and hardened by the battlefield, saw in it a possible answer to save Gondor. The kingdom was on the brink of collapse, clinging with its last strength against the onslaught of Mordor's darkness. And when a warrior is cornered, he cannot afford to ignore a possible path to victory. Boromir was no man for riddles or half-words. He needed concrete answers. To him, if Imladris held a secret, it was his duty to go there and uncover it. If there was a weapon, a strategy, or even a sliver of hope, he would bring it back to Gondor. After all, should the world truly depend on the success of this endeavor, there was no one better suited to defend it than he. But that decision wasn't simple. Faramir, deep down, felt that he should be the one to go. However, Boromir, as the elder brother and battle-hardened warrior, would not allow it. It wasn't just about authority. It was brotherly love. He knew the road would be long and dangerous, and he wouldn't let Faramir risk his life on an uncertain quest. Denethor, for his part, preferred Boromir as Gondor's representative. Deep down, perhaps he knew that Faramir's spirit was more inclined to contemplation than to war, and at that moment, Gondor needed action, not deliberation. Thus, Boromir prepared for a journey that no other warrior of his ilk had ever undertaken, A commander, a military leader, a man who knew the lands of Gondor like no one else, now had to rely on maps, rumors, and his own intuition to cross unknown territories. The weight of that mission was in the eyes of his people. They saw in him the last great hope of a kingdom that had already lost so much. If there was a truth hidden in Imladris, he would not rest until he found it. And so, without armies, without banners fluttering in the wind, without allies, Boromir set out, accompanied only by a horse, his sword, and his determination. With each step, he left behind not just his homeland, but also the certainty that his life would never be the same again. Destiny was already beginning to shape his path, and he could not have imagined that by the end of this journey, he would encounter something far more dangerous than the armies of Mordor, the very power of the One Ring. Boromir departed from Minas Tirith unescorted, without flags waving in the wind, without any grandeur befitting his title as Gondor's heir. Only a horse and his determination accompanied him. 100 days. That was the time it took to reach Rivendell, crossing unknown lands, facing treacherous roads and bearing alone the weight of a nation on his shoulders. He was a warrior, yes, but not a traveler. Accustomed to the battlefield, he had to learn to cope with loneliness and dangers that didn't come from swords, but from the journey itself. The crossing through Rohan was hard, but bearable. There were still allies there, and the open fields allowed horses to keep up without great difficulty. However, as he approached Eriador, challenges multiplied. Desolate roads, winding trails, and shadows that seemed to follow his every turn. At certain moments, he felt he was not alone. Hidden, eyes watched him in the darkness. Orcs lurked along the northern roads, and even without engaging in direct combat, Boromir knew that one misstep could cost him his life. The weather was no friend either. Torrential rains made the paths slippery, impeding progress. On one particularly difficult night, his mount got spooked while crossing a raging river, and he nearly got swept away by the current. He lost supplies, lost time, but not his purpose. He was a warrior forged by duty, and Gondor would not wait for excuses. Every day lost was a victory for the enemy. Hunger and exhaustion became constant companions. Unlike elves or Dunedain, Boromir did not possess tracking skills, nor was he used to depending solely on nature for survival. He learned the hard way, hunting small animals when necessary, improvising shelter in damp forests, and sleeping with one eye open, always alert. He was not an adventurer seeking glory. He was a man fulfilling a mission he didn't fully understand. And then, at the end of his journey, when he finally caught sight of Rivendell, he felt the weight of fatigue leave his body. But little did he know that this was not the end, but the true beginning. Boromir arrived at Elrond's house, ready to hear the answers he'd been seeking. Fate had brought him there, but what would he find? A solution for Gondor, or a burden far greater than any army could bear? Boromir reached Rivendell exhausted, yet with a sharp mind. After 100 days of travel, he was finally before those who could provide answers about the strange dream that had led him there. The hall of Elrond's council was grand, filled with figures that seemed straight out of legend. There were elves, dwarves, men, and even a long-bearded wizard, and at the center of the discussion, something he could never have foreseen: the One Ring. Not a symbol, not a myth, but Sauron's very own ring, glinting there within reach. The conversation progressed with carefully measured words and tense glances. They spoke of the ring's history, its power, and the horrors it would bring if it returned to Mordor. But Boromir saw the situation from another perspective. Why destroy something so powerful when it could be used against the Dark Lord himself? If Gondor had been holding back Mordor's advances for centuries without any aid, why not take advantage of this weapon and secure a decisive edge in the war? He wasn't foolish. He knew such power came with risks. But risks had been part of his life since birth. Yet his words were not well received. Aragorn, the strange and mysterious descendant of Isildur, disagreed, as did the wizard Gandalf and even the elves. They talked about the ring's corruption, about how no one could wield it without being consumed. But Boromir saw something the others seemed to ignore. While they debated philosophies and future dangers, Gondor was dying in the present. Every day of hesitation meant another city destroyed, another soldier lost. To him, the immediate need was to protect his people, not to get lost in academic debates about temptation and corruption. Frustrated, but with no other options, Boromir accepted the council's decision. The ring would not be used as a weapon. Instead, it was to be taken to Mordor to be destroyed. The plan was insane, an absurd idea that went against everything a warrior of Gondor had learned about war and strategy. But if that was the path, he would ensure the mission was completed. If anyone needed to bear that burden, it was under his protection. For if the world truly depended on the success of this venture, then no one was more capable of defending it than he. And so, Boromir became part of the Fellowship of the Ring. From a mere warrior fighting for his kingdom, he was now involved in something far greater than he had ever imagined. His instinct told him that that object was the key to victory. But the council had made him accept another truth. And as he departed with the other members of the Fellowship, one question hammered at his mind. Were they right? Or was he, Boromir of Gondor, the only one who could see the real solution to men's fate? Boromir was never a man of metaphors or riddles. To him, everything was solved by action, by the firmness of an arm wielding a sword. And now, there he was, part of a mission that made no sense for a warrior of Gondor. To destroy the ring, to throw it into the fire, while his people died within the walls of Minas Tirith. Yet, he knew that not everything could be solved by the strength of steel, and if that was the only choice available, then so be it. His commitment was clear, to protect the Fellowship and ensure that the ring reached its destination, whether he liked it or not. From the very beginning, Boromir stood out among the Fellowship's members. His presence was imposing, his spirit unyielding, while the hobbits trudged along, while the elves and dwarves exchanged barbs, while Aragorn maintained his ever-mysterious demeanor. Boromir stood firm, as solid as a wall. He knew what it meant to bear a responsibility. He knew the weight of a mission. It didn't matter if he agreed with the plan. Duty came first, just as in Gondor, where a warrior fights not for what he desires, but for what is necessary. In the early days of their journey, Boromir naturally demonstrated his leadership. He taught the hobbits how to handle a sword, teasing Merry and Pippin while keeping a keen eye on their safety. He protected the group's rear, always vigilant against any threat. Even without being the official leader, his natural authority was hard to ignore. It wasn't arrogance, it was experience. In war, there is no room for indecision. Either you lead or you're crushed by the enemy. And Boromir, without a shadow of doubt, was a born leader. But the journey was long and full of challenges. The cold bit hard, exhaustion consumed them, and dangers lurked around every bend. Boromir, used to short, intense battles, now faced a different kind of resistance, the exhaustion of uncertainty. He wasn't fighting against orcs or armies. He was battling against time itself, against the fragility of the hobbits, against decisions that weren't his to make. And deep down, something was beginning to trouble him. He saw Frodo carrying the ring, noticed how that small object seemed to call out to him, whispering promises that no one else appeared to hear. But it wasn't time to think about that. The road was still long, and the challenges were only beginning. Winter was approaching, and the Fellowship needed to decide how to cross the mountains. Boromir felt that wrong choices were being made, that caution was being traded for illusions. Yet, as always, he was ready to face any obstacle. For regardless of the journey's fate, one thing was certain. Boromir of Gondor would never run from a fight. The Fellowship's journey had already tested Boromir's patience, but nothing could have prepared him for the passage through the misty mountains. The group decided to take the Caradhras Pass, a treacherous route, battered by cold and the fury of the winds. Boromir, accustomed to the fortresses of Gondor and the heat of battle, was no stranger to winter. Yet this cold was different. It penetrated to the bone, sapping the strength of his limbs and making every step a challenge. He knew that this path was a mistake. He felt it in his very skin, even before the worst had arrived. And then the worst came. A storm rose, as if the mountain itself had turned against them. The snow fell heavy, and the hobbits, small and fragile, soon found themselves unable to continue. Boromir did not hesitate. Without waiting for orders or debating tactics, he took it upon himself to protect them. He lifted Frodo in his arms, forged a path through the snow with steady steps, and, without fanfare, began gathering wood for a fire. "If we're going to freeze to death, we might as well try something first," he grumbled, showing that even though he disagreed with the Fellowship's plan, his loyalty to the mission remained intact. The wood, of course, did little to help, but the gesture was remembered. While others hesitated, while the wizard pondered, while Aragorn observed, Boromir acted. He wasn't a strategist with grand schemes, nor a visionary like Gandalf. He was a practical man, forged in war. And he knew that sometimes the difference between life and death was a single act of decision. If those around him could be as resolute as he was, perhaps they wouldn't be stuck in the midst of the storm. In the end, they had to retreat. The mountain rejected them, as if an unseen force was determined to block their passage. Boromir had been right from the start. That path was folly, but his relief was short-lived. If they couldn't cross the mountains, only one alternative remained, one he didn't even want to consider: Moria. The very name sent shivers down his spine. That was not a land of men, and Boromir knew that great powers lurked there, deep, in the darkness. And then, as he brushed the snow from his clothes and looked at the worried faces of his companions, he realized something. The journey was no longer just a mission. It was a succession of bad choices and inevitable dangers. The path was growing darker, and Boromir began to wonder, were they really heading in the right direction? Or were they being guided by fate to a place where none of them should be? Boromir did not like Moria. From the very first moment the idea was mentioned, he opposed it. "What do we expect to find in a tomb?" he questioned, glancing at Gandalf with a skepticism not seen in the other members of the Fellowship. But the old wizard persisted, and the decision was made. Boromir knew that arguing further was futile. He could only move forward, keeping his sword ever within reach. If something lurked in the darkness, he would be ready. The entrance to Moria was anything but welcoming. The enormous stone door appeared abandoned for centuries, yet danger lurked just beyond. When the lake creature rose from the black waters, Boromir did not hesitate. He drew his sword and delivered swift blows, trying to fend off the tentacles that lashed out at the hobbits. But soon they realized that fighting there was futile. The only way out was to go deeper inside. With a terrifying crash, the entrance collapsed behind them. There was no turning back. Darkness swallowed them whole. Inside, Moria was a vast, silent tomb. Every step echoed like a whispered warning, and Boromir remained tense. It wasn't fear, it was instinct. Gondor had taught him always to be alert to shadows, and those shadows concealed something far worse than mere orcs. The tension grew with every corridor traversed, with every empty chamber they encountered. The Fellowship walked among the ruins of a fallen empire, and Boromir wondered if this wasn't a portent of what might befall Gondor if they failed. That portent soon became reality. In the Hall of Balin, they found the final account of Moria's dwarves, a belated warning inscribed on pages stained by time. They are coming, and they came. Drums sounded in the depths, shadows shifted, and orcs emerged like a black tide. Boromir, wasting no time, took the lead in battle. With precise strikes, he felled one troll after another, protecting the hobbits and covering the Fellowship's rear. He fought like a true warrior of Gondor, but the enemy was relentless. And then came the greatest threat of all, the Balrog, a creature as ancient as the world itself, a living flame of destruction. Boromir felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: helplessness. His sword, his strength, his training, none of it would do against a monster born from the darkness of the past. There was only one option left: to flee. But not everyone made it. Gandalf stayed behind, facing the beast alone. "Run, you fools!" he shouted before being dragged into the abyss. Boromir stared into the void, feeling the weight of loss. The wizard was gone, and now the Fellowship was without a guide, without direction, and the worst was yet to come. After the tragedy in Moria, Boromir felt the journey's weight as never before. Gandalf's death left the Fellowship shaken, adrift, and even he, a warrior accustomed to loss, could not ignore the void the wizard had left behind. But there was no time for mourning. The path led them to the Golden Wood, Lothlorien, the realm of the elves, a land of indescribable beauty, where even the air seemed enchanted. However, Boromir didn't see Lorien as a refuge, but as a strange, unsettling place. Something about that forest disturbed him. The elves, with their ethereal looks and enigmatic gazes, were unlike any people he had known. Yet none unsettled him as much as Lady Galadriel. Boromir felt her gaze pierce him like an invisible blade. He couldn't tell if it was magic or something deeper, but he had the clear impression that she saw inside him. Beyond words, beyond armor, it was as if she saw not only the warrior, but also the man behind the sword, and that made him uncomfortable. Then came the temptation. In the silent night, Galadriel offered visions to each member of the Fellowship, whispering possibilities, fears and hidden destinies. Boromir didn't need to hear her voice to know his weakness, the One Ring. He didn't need anyone to say it. He already felt the desire growing in his heart. And what if he used it? What if that power were in his hands? He could march on Mordor, cast out Sauron, and save Gondor from ruin. And above all, prove that everyone was wrong. But fear also set in. If Galadriel could see his thoughts, then others would begin to notice too. And indeed, Frodo already cast wary glances in his direction. Aragorn appeared even more attentive. To his gestures, the tension within the Fellowship grew, even if no one spoke of it openly. Boromir wasn't a traitor, yet something inside him was beginning to change. He knew the ring was dangerous, but what if the real mistake was to ignore its potential? The group wouldn't remain long in Lothlorien, yet Boromir left that place altered. The temptation hadn't disappeared. On the contrary, it had grown stronger. As the Fellowship continued on their path, an ever-growing doubt gnawed at him. Were they destroying the only chance for victory, or were they simply refusing to see the obvious? Boromir couldn't say for sure. But one thing was clear. The ring had already taken root in his thoughts, and the battle he was about to face wouldn't be against orcs or monsters. It would be against himself. The effect of the ring was subtle, yet relentless. Boromir, the warrior of Gondor, the defender of the walls, the man whose strength had never wavered, now felt his mind taken over by a constant whisper. At first, it was just an occasional thought, a suggestion, a possibility. But as the days passed and the Fellowship descended the great river Anduin, the idea grew like a poisoned seed. Why were they destroying such a powerful weapon? Why were they handing over their only hope of victory to the enemy's fire? He watched Frodo clutching the ring, guarding it as if it were something sacred. It irked him. Here was a mere hobbit, fragile and naive, who did not understand the weight of war. How could someone so small be entrusted with such a tremendous burden? And worse, why did the others accept this without question? Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, they all blindly followed the council's plan. But Boromir saw reality with clarity. He was a soldier. He knew war. And he knew better than anyone that a war isn't won by ideals. It's won with power. Each night, the thought grew stronger. He tried to push it away, to remember who he was and why he had accepted that mission. But the ring had a will of its own, infiltrating his mind subtly. He began watching Frodo more often, his eyes fixed on the chain that held the object. And what if he just took it? Not for himself, of course, for Gondor, to save his people. He didn't want power for his own sake. He wanted to use it for the good of all. Wasn't that the duty of a true protector? Yet the ring didn't merely persuade, it isolated. Boromir started to notice that others were watching his behavior. Aragorn eyed him with increasing suspicion. Legolas grew more reserved. Even the hobbits seemed uneasy around him. The Fellowship was no longer as united as before. The journey's weight was wearing them down, and the ring exploited every fissure to extend its influence. He tried to resist, but a cruel truth pounded in his mind. Why hold back if everything could be resolved with a single act? And so, destiny drew near. The moment when Boromir would have to make a decision. The conflict was no longer against Sauron or his armies. It was a battle fought within him. And as the Fellowship prepared to decide their next move, Boromir knew that his inner struggle was about to erupt into something irreversible. Boromir never planned to betray anyone. He didn't wake up that morning determined to confront Frodo, nor did he devise a meticulous scheme to seize the ring. But the truth is, the ring didn't need plans. It worked in silence, in doubts, in small whispers that turned into shouts in the mind of those who desired it. And Boromir, after so much resistance, finally gave in. At Amon Hen, when the Fellowship paused to decide their next steps, he saw his chance. Frodo was alone, and Boromir went after him. At first, he tried to argue. His words carried genuine conviction. He truly believed that the ring could save Gondor. Just for a moment, Frodo. Just lend me the ring. But the hobbit recoiled, his eyes already filled with fear. And when Boromir realized that his words wouldn't suffice, his tone changed. Anger, frustration, the pressure of a lifetime of sacrifices exploding all at once. He approached, trying to grab Frodo, but the small ring-bearer vanished before. His eyes using the power of the object itself to flee. The shock was immediate. As soon as Frodo disappeared, a cold clarity fell upon Boromir like a blade. What had he done? He wasn't a tyrant, he wasn't a traitor, yet there he was trying to seize the ring like any servant of Sauron. Desperation took hold of him. He shouted Frodo's name, ran through the trees, but he knew it was too late. The Fellowship could no longer be kept together. The bond that held them had been broken, and the guilt fell upon him. He threw himself to the ground, fists clenched into the earth, his chest rising and falling in a frantic rhythm. What had the ring done to him? He, Boromir of Gondor, always loyal, always noble, now reduced to a man who tried to snatch something by force from a companion. Regret consumed him, but there was no time for lamentation. The Fellowship was in danger. If Frodo had fled, then the others needed to be warned, and so, with a heavy heart, Boromir rose. His error had been grave, yet he could still fight. There was still something he could do to atone for his failure. For in the end, a true warrior is defined not only by the battles he wins, but by the fights he chooses to wage until his final breath. Boromir did not yet know that his final moment was drawing near. As he ran through the forests of Amon Hen, trying to piece together the shattered fellowship, the enemy was already advancing. Saruman's Uruk-hai were out there, hunting the hobbits, ready to execute their master's orders. And then he saw them, Merry and Pippin, defenseless and surrounded. In that instant, all doubts, all temptations, all errors vanished. There was only one thing left: to fight. Without hesitation, Boromir raised his sword and attacked. The Uruk-hai were brutal warriors, bred to kill, yet he did not back down. His blade sliced through the air, his strikes were precise, and his battle cry echoed among the trees like thunder before a storm. They came in great numbers, but Boromir was no ordinary soldier. He was the heir of Gondor, trained to endure when all seemed lost. And he endured. Then came the first arrow. A Jasso, precise, cruel shot, straight to the chest. He staggered but did not fall. His breathing grew heavy, but his determination remained unbroken. He kept fighting. The second arrow came, and the pain was unbearable. Yet still, his sword did not stop. He was a living shield, a wall between the hobbits and their foes. And, even when the third arrow pierced his flesh, he still stood. Because that was the essence of Boromir. He never gave up. But even the greatest warriors have their limits. The Uruk-hai advanced, seizing Merry and Pippin, and finally, Boromir fell to his knees. His body betrayed his will, yet his spirit did not yield. He had failed to resist the ring, but he would not fail in his duty to protect the innocent. His time was running out, yet he still had one last moment, a moment to find peace, redemption, and to speak the words he had never spoken before. And then, in his final moments, Aragorn appeared. Too late to save Boromir, but not too late to hear his last words. For a warrior may fall, but his legacy endures. And in that moment, Boromir, the son of Gondor, found his true redemption. Boromir lay fallen, but not defeated. His body, marked by the arrows of the Uruk-hai, no longer responded as it once had. Every breath was a struggle. Every word required more strength than any battle he had fought. Yet there was something he still needed to say. When Aragorn knelt by his side, Boromir saw not merely a leader, but the hope of Gondor, the king his people had long awaited, the man he himself had hesitated to accept. And in that moment there was no more pride, no more resistance, only the truth remained. "I have failed you," he murmured, his voice weakened. The weight of guilt was there, for having tried to take the ring, for having caused the fellowship to break apart, for not being able to protect Merry and Pippin. But Aragorn did not judge him. There was no reproach, only compassion. "You fought bravely," replied the future king, holding Boromir with the respect that a true warrior deserved. And then Boromir did what Denethor had never allowed him to do. He surrendered, not to weakness, not to fear, but to the truth. "Our people, my brother, protect them." He asked not for himself, nor for glory, only for the sake of Gondor. For in the end that had always been his greatest wish, and Aragorn solemnly promised. It was in that moment that Boromir found his redemption. No matter his mistakes, no matter his flaws, he departed as a true son of Gondor, honored until his final breath. His funeral was not held in a grand hall, nor were there crowds mourning his loss, but his resting was dignified. Laid in a funeral boat sent down the river, Boromir followed his final path, enveloped by waters reflecting the skies. His body would vanish in the currents, but his memory would live on. For heroes may fall, but their deeds are never forgotten, and so Gondor lost its champion. But perhaps, just perhaps, it gained something even greater. The promise of a new king, a leader who would carry not only the crown, but also Boromir's legacy. For in the end, even in the face of death, a true warrior never truly disappears. He becomes part of history. Boromir's story is more than a tragedy. It is a reflection of the internal struggle we all face. How many times have we felt pressured by duty, tempted by shortcuts, consumed by the desire to protect those we love, even if it leads us to questionable choices? Boromir was not defeated by weakness, but by his own humanity. And that is exactly what makes him so unforgettable. His mistakes did not define him. His final actions did. In the crucial moment, he did not choose the ring. He chose to fight, chose to resist until the very last second, facing a legion of enemies alone to protect his comrades. He fell, yes, but he fell as a true warrior. And in the end, he was forgiven, not only by Aragorn, but by history itself. And now I ask you, how many times have you judged Boromir without truly understanding his story? How many times have you found yourself in a similar position, wrestling with inner dilemmas, with difficult decisions? Boromir's greatest lesson lies not in his downfall, but in his redemption. He teaches us that even the strongest can fail, and that failure does not mean they cannot rise again. If this story has led you to see Boromir in a new light, then the mission has been accomplished. But tell me, which character in The Lord of the Rings do you think is the most misunderstood? I want to know your opinion in the comments. And of course, if you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We have many more epic stories to explore. See you in the next video.